Mr. Chairman, for the introduction. Also, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for the invitation. In this talk, I would like to focus on kinetic and material property effects on fingering instability in counterflow smoldering combustion. So the main interest here is we're trying to investigate how a material's kinetic and the nature of the material affects the propagation of fingering instability in counterflow smoldering combustion. So this is the outline of my talk. First, I will introduce the general conception, the problem we are trying to look at here. And from there, I'll discuss some of the experimental results that has been conducted on this research, and also some other literatures that has treated this kind of problems. So from there, I will go to our modeling strategy, how we intend to, from our own point of view, tackle this kind of problem. And from there, I'll present the I will show the some numerical results and finally summarize my talk. Oh shit. Why? View?
Just over there.
Oh?
Yeah, come to one. Yeah.
This one?
No.
This one?
Up. Control L.
Control
L. Below. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you. Okay. So, the picture we are looking at, it's a typical example of what we mean by combustion to start with. Here we are looking at two different regimes of combustion problem. The first one here is flaming. In a flaming combustion, usually what we have is gaseous phase combustion. But on the right, we have the smoldering combustion. Smoldering combustion just represents a kind of non-flaming form of combustion. And for this kind of combustion, the propagation is low, and also it involves low temperature, and it is difficult to detect. The difficulty in detecting this kind of propagation is a direct consequence why smoldering is considered as a hazard to fire. So, as an application of smoldering, we have it can be used to control the spread of fire in porous materials, and also it is used in oil recovery. So, since we are basically interested in counterflow smoldering propagation, because there are different modes of this type of propagation, but here we want to focus on the counterflow smoldering combustion. So what does that mean? It means that if we have a typical material, say this, and this material is considered to be porous in the sense that we can identify pores and also some solid materials. So in this setting, counterflow means that we have the flow of an oxidizer gas from one end, and this material is ignited from the other end. So what happens is that in this setting, the flow of the oxidizer moves opposite to the direction of reaction propagation. So this smoldering configuration does not actually promote the propagation of a flame, because since oxygen as an oxidizer is moving into this from this direction, and suppose we can identify suppose this is the location of the reaction front, and we have flow from this direction. So basically the reaction is only taking place at this narrow zone here. So behind this narrow zone, we just have combustion product. And in this setting, we have that the oxidizer and the material flow into this narrow combustion zone from the same direction. So since so for a combustion problem, for combustion to take place efficiently, we should have sufficient heat, oxygen, and also the fuel. So if we deprive the combustion, any of these quantities here, it means that the combustion will quench. So here, this zone is here is a hot zone, and which it's very narrow. Okay, if I can identify it with epsilon, and okay, and within this zone here, this is the heating zone. The material is heated and enters into the combustion zone, the reaction zone, sorry. In this setting here now, since the material is supposed to be heated, then combustion chemical reactions take place. But this oxidizing gas here is depriving the material of sufficient heat. So this type of setting usually leads to the quenching of a combustion process. So because the type of material is very important in what I'm about to discuss here today, so I would like to show some of the examples of porous or some materials which are combustible. For example, like here on the left we have the polyurethane foam, which as we can see, it's a typical example of a porous material. The picture you are looking at on the right side here is a microscopic view of a filter paper sample. So suppose we look at this material on the scale of a microscope. We observe that actually this material is not as homogeneous as we can see it at this scale. So at this point, this problem becomes of interest to us and this basically raises some questions on how can we describe a combustion problem for such a material having this kind of complex structure. Then since here we see that the structure is kind of irregular, we cannot actually say at this point if this material has a uniform structure or the material, the flow of, for example, reactants or heat along this material is towards some or more in some direction and less in others. So we also want to understand how can the structure of such a material influence the pattern formation. So first of all, I would like to consider a typical example of counterflow smoldering combustion, which has been experimentally conducted, but in a controlled environment, because what I showed earlier on is a typical case of a natural environment where we have oxygen is flowing in a natural sense. But in this setting here, the flow of oxygen is controlled. And also, the type of setup that was used in this experiment is such that natural convection is or eliminated so that we don't have any effect coming from the vertical direction of flow. So this experiment is basically conducted in a kind of Herschel cell where a filter paper sample is placed between two parallel plates. For example, we have if this thing is thin, okay, this plate has a vertical height, say h. So we have this kind of setting where within this place, the material is placed here. We have the material here, and oxygen, it's maybe forced from this direction, and ignition is set up here. That is uniform ignition is set up at this point. So what is most important here is the role of this vertical height in controlling the behavior of the instability. So the experiment is basically already conducted some years ago by some group of physicists called Moses and his co-workers. So in their experiment, these are some of the observations they made. For example, in the first case, they said that this type of fingering instability is due to oxygen deficiency. That is, if we deprive the combustion, the flow of oxygen, that the combustion process will start developing this kind of diffusional instability due to less and less oxygen in the system. So the second point here is that as the fingers as they propagate, they tend to split but strictly avoid each other. And there exists a kind of a critical amount of oxygen flow that can be supplied in the system, and the fingers will merge together, and we no longer have fingering, but just a stable propagating wave. So in the experiments based on the regime of oxygen flow, they were able to distinguish 3 distinct fingering states. Sorry, I did not mention earlier that our focus in these pictures, because usually it's very difficult for someone to understand what this means. So our focus is in the dark sections of this picture. So forget about the white part. So the dark part of this picture represents the char, or the product of combustion, and the white part is just the areas of this combustion, the quenched part of the flame. So in the first picture here, if we suppose we have a very critical amount of low oxygen supply, the fingers will start propagating as sparse fingers that are distantly spaced. So if we increase the supply of oxygen, then the tips of the fingers will start splitting in this way. So as we increase further the supply of oxygen, we have a connected front. So the next observation is that, suppose, as I showed here, suppose we start controlling the vertical height. For example, if we start increasing the height of this shell, it means that normally we are introducing natural convection in the system. So the fingers begin to increase in width. The fingering, yes, we have from here we have 0.2 H. Then as H increases from this point to this point, the fingers begin to increase in width. And also, as you can observe, the fingers also exhibit less and less tip splitting. The tip splitting is suppressed as we increase further the vertical height. So these are some related models that have been proposed in order to solve this kind of phenomena. For example, in the first case here, these people use a kind of a pore network simulator to investigate this fingering instability using the same diffusion type mechanism, the diffusion instability mechanism. Most of the works here are just interested in the existence of traveling waves in this kind of problem. So based on these models, because as we can see, almost all of them, they did not pay much attention to the nature of the material that was used for this kind of experiment. So we tried to do something different. So here I present our approach, what we did in order to solve this problem. So the method we use here is called the homogenization of periodic structures, because the method is based on periodic assumption on the structure of the material. Is not the physical material, as we can see from here, is not periodic. But other studies have shown that it is possible to use such an assumption to obtain a microscopic system that is capable of reproducing the behavior of the heterogeneous system. That is, what we are trying to do is to, instead of considering the complex structure as we see it here, we reduce to a periodic approximation of this structure here. And because even at this stage, we still have problem, because at this stage, because what we are trying to do is to, in this sort of media, to impose reaction diffusion equations that describes the process of interest. But we cannot be able to do this in this medium because since for smoldering combustion, the reaction only takes place at the surface of the solid. And looking at this picture here, what we are going to do is to prescribe at the boundaries of these circular objects here boundary condition reaction terms for the problem. So the starting point here is, since we can identify the nature of this material at this point, so what is important is for us to ask ourselves which components can be identified in such a complex media. For example, we understand that there are some parts of this material that are solid and some part of it are just perforations. So yeah, we can construct a representative unit like this, where this part we call the gas-filled part, and this part is the solid part of this representative material here. So using a periodic assumption, this basic unit can be translated to cover the entire material of interest, like this one here. So from here we have our heterogeneous medium, which on application of the homogenization technique, we can arrive at a homogeneous medium. But what is interesting here is that to be able to do this kind of procedure, we see that if you can identify at this level that the size of a pore, the pore space, the size of a pore space at this level is much less than the size of the entire material. So it's possible for us to be able to do this kind of thing here. So for that, we represent the size at this level, the characteristic size of the system at this level, and this over the ratio of this size over the entire system size as a scale parameter, which here epsilon. So this gives us a condition that allows us to treat this problem in this sense, because we have a separation of scales. So since this phenomena is basically not dependent on the fluid, that is the full fluid dynamics of the problem. So we simply approximate the flow field by the following here. I will discuss what this means for the problem later on. So also, since the process is just a chemical reaction process where we have a solid fuel and the oxygen reacting to give us a solid product and some gas product, which for this problem is not so important. And also the release of heat that drives or sustains the combustion process. So the type of, for this chemical mechanism, we use the Arrhenius type kinetics for the reaction rate. So here I like to describe the geometry of the problem of interest. So here we have for the, we consider a rectangular medium, which is a bounded domain in R2, and the boundary has both Neumann and Dirichlet boundary conditions. So the x X here represents the microspace variable, because in the sense of our description here, it means that since we have introduced a basic unit inside this system here, we have additional variable coming in here. So we represent this variable as the microspace variable, then t is the time variable, then y is our basic unit cell. Then yx, as I said before, is an open set of this basic unit cell with smooth boundary represented by this. So we simply call this part the solid part of the problem. Then the gas part is simply represented by removing the solid part. We have this gas part here. So at the boundary between the gas part and the solid part, we have this representing the outer normal on this boundary with respect to the gas part. So because starting from the unit cell, we need to translate this unit cell to cover the entire space of R2. So we have for any subset y of contained in our unit cell and integer vectors, we can define a translation of this form. And also we can define for the boundary of between the gas and solid part, we can define as the following, using this definition here. So using this scale factor, it means now that we need to rescale. We need to rescale the unit cells so that they can fit into the material of interest. So here, the example of the solid part is just represented as omega x, where if we remove the solid part from the domain, we just have the skeleton we represent as the gas part. So since in this problem we basically have two competing transport mechanisms. The first one is the transport of heat, and the second one here is the transport of mass, of reactants. So we describe a heat transport equation for the temperature in the gas part, and also a heat conduction equation for the solid part of the problem. And C here represents the mass transport of oxygen. So the kinetic equation here represents the solid product, which basically is just the essence of this equation here is just like the way I refer to it as a history, because the process, it can basically be represented by here, because here we have the two important transport mechanisms required for this kind of problem, the mass transport of oxygen and the heat transport in the different phases. So here is just a history of showing the propagation of the thermal front as it propagates along the material. So this time represents our reaction rate. The coefficients here represent the heat capacity in the gas and the solid, And this is the thermal conductivities in the two physics, lambda of G and lambda of X. And here we have the diffusion coefficient of oxygen. TA is the activation temperature, and TS is just the temperature at the surface. Then A here is the pre-exponential factor, since we are describing our reaction by Arrhenius kinetics. So at the boundary between the solid and the gas, we prescribe the following conditions for the temperature and the concentration. We are here again, Q here represents the heat release. So, since it is quite difficult for us to, at the level of the heterogeneous media that we've arrived at, it's difficult for us to make any useful numerical investigation at that point, due to the distributed nature of because the reaction rates are simply distributed on all the circular surfaces of the medium. So it will be a problem to make any kind of numerical analysis or say something about the propagation of fronts at this level. So we need some sort of approximation. And one possible way for us to do this is to assume that the solution of the microscopic model is in this form, in the form of an asymptotic expansion, where we represent the microscale variable as depending on the microscale variable through the small scale parameter. So each time of this expansion, we assume it to be periodic in the variable y. And what we do, since here now, due to the presence of this, we have y and x variable, that means we have a kind of two scales in the system. So what we require at this stage is to also transform for example, we need a transformation of the gradient such that with this transformation, and also using this expansion here, we introduce the asymptotic expansion in the PDE system and identify different problems depending on epsilon. So this leads to a succession of epsilon problems which look exactly of this form, where here the divergence of x of phi I minus 1 is just acting as a source term, because all the problems at this stage are posed on the y cell, which basically depends on the variable y, where x is just a kind of parameter. So if we do this, our result is as epsilon goes to 0, because in the expansion we are mostly interested in the first term of the expansion. As epsilon goes to 0, we obtain the following problems. The first problem here allows us to, in a convergent sense, it allows us to correct the solution of the homogenized solution by introduction of higher order terms. And also, it allows us to compute effective parameters like the ones shown, the diffusion and the conductivity tensors here. So this is the form of our derived microscopic model by using this approach of homogenization of periodic structures. So we have this form where phi here represents the porosity of the system, and this is the surface porosity, and this is the effective thermal diffusion tensors here. So yeah, at this point we see that what we are able to achieve with this homogenization step is for us to be able to guess the form of a microscopic model that we can use for the study of the phenomenon of interest. And also we have effective parameters coming into the equation. In the microscopic system, we have a system that depends on the gas phase and the solid phase temperature. But here we have only a one temperature system representing the entire homogeneous medium. So the definition of the effective parameters is given as follows, where we use the solution of the cell problem for the computation of the effective parameters. Also for the volumetric heat capacity, it's defined in the following sense. So for application, we rescale the system in the following form, suitable for a combustion problem, but we are trying to look at two different types of problems. The first one is for the case where the effective diffusion coefficients are just scalars. So in this case, the system reduces in a non-dimensional form to the following form, where the most interesting parameters in this system are the lowest number and the Perklet number. Basically, we are going to analyze the behavior of this system using the lowest number, where the Perklet number just simply plays the role of conditioning the behavior of the patterns. For example, if at some high value of the Perklet number, the tip splitting behavior can be enhanced. So this N here is just a non-dimensional activation energy.
Excuse me, can you still over?
Sorry? Okay. So also we have the case for anisotropic materials here. And yeah, through rescaling we can also see that the anisotropic materials have the following form for the thermal diffusion tensors. So the mechanism we are trying to use is the following, where when the lowest number is high, then the patterns are connected, and when it is low, then we have unstable patterns. So we try to mimic the experiment. We obtain the following distant states for the connected front and the tip splitting and the sparse fingers. So next is we try to understand the behavior of the material by considering both isotropic case. In the isotropic case, we just set the off diagonal of the matrices to 0, and for the anisotropic case, we have the following results here. Here we see that the patterns are non-uniform, but here we have uniform patterns. So again, we also have, suppose we suppress the effect of heat release by controlling the pre-exponential factor. We see that it has effect on the thickness of the fingers. So in this presentation, what we've done is to derive a microscopic description to capture the microscopic fingering behavior of a sample material of interest. So we've also seen how anisotropic can affect the structure of the fingering instability, and also since in this model we don't have any other heat mechanisms except by controlling the effect of heat through the reaction rate. So we still need to do more on the role of heat mechanism on the finger weight. So finally, as an open question, there is no mathematical theory for the mechanism of T-splitting as concerning this type of problem yet. So thank you.
So time is still over. So if you have any